What's up, everyone? Creating and managing forms doesn't need to be difficult. Payload CMS provides a plugin for building forms, and I'm going to walk through a full setup of how to configure your forms, render them, protect them from spam, and even connect them to a third party. If you want the code I use in this video, the link to the repo is in the description. Now, let's dive in. Simply put, the Payload CMS Form Builder plugin allows you to build and manage custom forms directly within your admin panel. You no longer need to hard code a new form each time you need one. Of course, if you only have a form or two, it may not make sense to go through all these steps to set up the plugin. But if you imagine having many forms, this plugin makes it easy to create those forms and put them wherever you need them. You can use this plugin for contact forms, newsletter signups, quote requests, and much more. You can even enable your forms to receive payments. The Form Builder plugin is flexible in that it allows your editors and other users to define the form schema based on their needs directly in the admin UI. This frees you up as a dev from getting a new request every time marketing needs a new form, so you can focus on more important tasks. How does it work? You configure the plugin in your payload config. Then you'll create the necessary block for your front end to map through the form schema you defined. When the form is submitted, the submission is collected in your database and can be routed to a variety of sources like your CRM. Once submitted, you can either redirect someone to a new page or show an on-screen confirmation. You can also configure an email to be sent to you and the person who filled out the form, and that email has access to the fields you define. So, all this sounds like a lot of extra work when you can just embed forms from HubSpot or MailChimp. And that may be true depending on your use case. But for at least HubSpot, you would need to include their branding on your forms unless you pay for one of their plans, which aren't cheap. You also only have the option to embed forms with JavaScript, which isn't necessarily the most optimal way. Instead of embedding third-party branded JavaScript forms, you can use the Form Builder to build forms native to your website, easily styled to your UI, and then send data to wherever you need it to go, whether HubSpot, MailChimp, or anywhere else by using their APIs, which only require an account. To start, we'll need to install the plugin by running npm add at Payload CMS plugin Form Builder. Once this installs, we can go to our package.json and make sure that this installed at the same version as the rest of our packages. And it looks like it did not, so we can remove the pin and have it install at 3.27. So I can run pnpmi to update the version. We then need to go to our payload config and add the Form Builder plugin to our plugins array. And we'll add it to the top just so it's easier to find. And we can add our Form Builder plugin, which should import automatically into my IDE. After that, we can run pnpm dev so we can see what this looks like in our back end. You can see by default that a new form and form submission collection had been created for you. Form submissions is where you'll have access to all the responses to all of the forms on your website. The form collection is where you'll define your form schema. In this collection, by default, you have access to all the basic fields that come with the plugin. If you want to exclude certain fields, you can do that by including the fields option in your plugin. So we'll include fields as an object and set state to false, select to false, country to false, and finally payment to false. And so now we won't see these show up in our field selectors for our forms. So now if we go into our forms and create a new form, and if we create a field, we can see that we only have checkbox, email, message, number, text, and Textarea to select from. State, select, country, and payment do not exist. If I wanted to add select back, I could, just by setting select to true or removing it from this object here. And now we can see that our select field has shown up. We'll leave this as false. There's more we can do here, but we'll come back to fields later on in this video. The next option available to us is the redirectRelationships option. This takes an array of collection slugs. This defines what collections you want to be able to choose from for your confirmation page after a form is submitted. I don't typically like using redirects and prefer using the option to show a message, but we'll include our pages slug here so we can see how it works in the admin UI. The next option is before email, which is a before change hook that's called right before an email is sent, but after it's been prepared. This allows you to style your email before it's sent after the form submission, among other things. To get the most out of this, we're going to create a constant up above our build config, and we're going to call this constant before email. We'll need to pull in two types. The first one is the before email type, which will come from our Payload CMS plugin form builder types, as well as our form submission type from payload types. We can then set this equal to an arrow function. For the props, we will include our emails and our before change params. As you can see from my IDE suggestions here, the emails option is a formatted email array. So we're going to need, when we return our email, we're going to need to map through our emails array, pulling out the email item, and we then need to return the email and then whatever option we want to edit. So here we could just return the email.html, but we want to do a little bit more than that. So we will create some HTML here. We'll have a div that will have a style element, which will have h1 at font size 3 rem. Then we'll have a paragraph tag of font size 1 rem and a font weight of bold and padding 1 rem and a border of 1 pixel solid dark green with a border radius of 0.5 rem. With that done, we can then open another div and pass in our email.html and then close off our initial div there. Now we can take this before email constant and include it as an option here in our form builder plugin. Under our before email option, we can include a default to email address, which defaults to your email plugin configuration. If you want a different email though, you can include that here. So just as an example, I will include my email address here, and then we'll have our form overrides. You can use this option to extend or override any part of the form collection that's automatically created for you. One thing to note here is that by default, your forms are publicly available to be read. The emails field that we'll discuss later is locked to only be read by authenticated users to protect sensitive email addresses from being exposed publicly. You can use form overrides to change that access if you'd like to. To show this in action, we'll change our slug to forms and add the admin group of forms. We'll also set access update to be only for our editor access and higher. You can also add new fields here. I know we'll be coming back to enable form submissions to be sent to HubSpot, as well as create a way to filter spam using CAPTCHA. So we'll include fields around that. So I'll include our fields option and pass in our default fields to then be used in an array where we'll pass in our default fields. And then we can add our name of HubSpot ID, which will have a label of HubSpot ID. And we can then position it in our sidebar. Underneath name, we'll add the type of text for this HubSpot ID field. Underneath the HubSpot ID field, we're going to need a new checkbox field, which has the name of require reCAPTCHA, and we'll have the label of require reCAPTCHA with a question mark, and position it in the sidebar as well. I mentioned earlier that I don't typically use redirects for form submissions. Let's hide the confirmation type radio field that switches between redirect and confirmation message, just so I don't have to have it available every time I create a form. So back up here in our default fields, we can map through our default fields and get our field item and open up a function. We'll check if field type is equal to radio and the field name is equal to confirmation type, and then we can return our field, all of the options in the field just as they are, but change hidden to true, so it no longer shows up. Otherwise, we can just return the field. Now, when we load up our form, we can see that the confirmation type no longer exists here. But we can then also see that we have HubSpot ID and require reCAPTCHA here just as we planned. Next up is the form submission overrides option. This works much the same way as the form overrides, but for the form submission collection. This is where we'll write a hook to send our form submissions to HubSpot later on. But for now, we can do a couple of simple changes. First, in our form submissions override, we'll set our slug to be form submissions, and then also put this in the admin group forms. And then when we save this and go back to our collections, we can see that now our forms and form submissions are together in our forms group here. Now, we won't talk too much about how to handle payments, so we won't talk about the handle payment option here, but do know that it is available to you to use in the Form Builder plugin. This is another before change hook that gets called when a form is submitted. It can integrate with any third-party payment processing API like Stripe to allow people to send payments to you. Of course, you would need to enable the payment field to access this. And speaking of fields, let's go back up to the top of our Form Builder plugin where we have our fields option, and we can start digging into what fields are available to us. First, you should know that when I mention fields here, I'm actually talking about a payload block. Payload uses blocks with payload fields to define form field configurations to be used in your form schema. More on that in a moment. We'll set each of these fields that we're going to go over as true as we discuss them. The first is going to be text, which we'll set to true. This collects a single line string, just like a normal text field from Payload. Textarea allows you to collect a multi-line string and doesn't include rich text, so you'll only collect plain text information here. Email is used to collect a user's email information and shouldn't be confused with the emails field in the form collection. Number and checkbox fields are also available to you, with the number field collecting an arbitrary number from a user and the checkbox allowing you to collect a Boolean value for something like accepting terms and conditions. I mentioned I won't use select, state, or country fields, but so you know what they do, select allows you to create a select input to display options you create, while the state field is used to collect information about a US state through a select input on the front end. Lastly, country is used to collect information about a user's country. Each of the fields I just mentioned have name, label, default value, width, and required as default fields. The only one that has an additional field is the select field, which allows you to define an options array. The last field we'll discuss is the message option, which is a rich text component that can be used to display an arbitrary message anywhere on the form. By default, this only includes a rich text field and no inputs. Payments are also accepted, but we've set this to false. You have the additional price conditions option at your disposal that can help you control how much something costs. For example, you can add $10 after a user checks a box to add an item or something similar to that. I've alluded a couple times to the ability to define your own block, so let's do that now. You can define your own field by providing a block config. To include the default fields of another block, we'll want to import fields from Payload CMS Form Builder plugin, which is right here, so we'll add fields. And with that added, let's add our own custom phone number field, and we'll add that to the top of our fields object here. Under the fields option, we can add a phone key here, and we'll pull in our fields.text, and then we'll include our slug, which we'll have as phone, and we'll include some labels as well, which will have a singular label of phone number and a plural value of phone numbers. You'll notice here that we get a type error for our slug option. But we can go to our form, create a new form, add a field, and we can see our phone number shows up just fine. So what's happening here is likely some kind of type issue in the source code. So we can just set a TS ignore here and know that this field is going to work perfectly fine, even with this type error going on. If you want to add your own payload fields to these block configs, you can do that, but you'll need to replace all the other fields in addition to the new field you want. As far as I can tell, there is no way to include default fields without redefining everything. So let's do that now. to add an option for a placeholder and the ability to hide a field. We're going to create a new directory in our blocks that we'll call form. Inside this, we're going to create a new TypeScript file that we'll call field config. And this will just be a TypeScript file. We can then import type field from payload, and we're going to create a couple of constants, all with the field type assigned to them. So we'll have a constant for name, another one for label, one for require, then one for placeholder, another one for default value, width, and then we'll have one for hidden as well. We'll set all of these equal to an empty object and open up that object. Since I want most of these to have a width of 50, I'll just type in admin width of 50% and just remove this from our width field here. Up in our constant of name, we're going to set the name of this to name with the type of text and a label of name. And just to keep it consistent with how Payload CMS does this, we'll add this little note here that says lowercase, no special characters. It will be required. Under label, we'll set our name to label, our type to text, a label of label, and then that one's done as well. For our constant required, we're going to include the name required with the type of checkbox, the label of required, and then this one is done. In placeholder, we're going to have the name be placeholder, the type of text, label, placeholder, and then this one is done. Our default value is going to have a name of default value, a type of text, and a label of default value. We'll come back to our width in just a second, and for hidden, we're going to set name hidden, type checkbox, and then label it hidden field question mark. And now we came back to our width because we're going to define this as a name of width and a type of select. So this one is different from everything else we've done so far. We'll set some options to choose from so we can get our width on the front end. So we'll use value of full to label at 100%. And then I'm going to copy this a couple more times. So we'll set the label here to be 75%, 66%, 50%, 33%, and then finally 25%. And we can update the values where we'll need 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3, and 3/4. Lastly, we need to export all of these. So we'll include placeholder width hidden, name required, and label. And lastly, our default value. So we should have 7 fields being exported here. Now in our payload config, we can come up to the top and import all of these fields that we just created. And we can start using these in our new phone number field. So we'll come back down to our plugin and remove our fields.text. Instead, we're going to create an empty fields array and then start adding the fields that we want to include. So first, each of these are going to be a type of row, which will then include at least one field in it. So we'll just copy this 3 more times for our phone field here, and we'll include name and label here. We'll include placeholder and default value here. We'll do our width here, and finally required and hidden in our last row. We'll then need to, of course, add commas to the end of all of these. We'll take our fields array here and then open up an object into our text. And just so we can see things a little bit more clearly, we're going to add a labels object, which will have a singular label of single line text and a plural option of single line text as well. And then we'll paste our fields option here. We'll keep the name and label, placeholder, default value, width, required, and hidden just as they are. In our text area, we are going to change things up a little bit, but we're still going to open up our object and pass in our fields where we'll have name, label, placeholder, no width because we always want this to be 100%, and then required and hidden we will keep as well. And finally, for email, we'll include our fields again where we'll have our name, label, placeholder. We'll include width here instead of our default value, and then keep required and hidden in their own row as well. So now after our email, we'll set our checkbox to also have a fields array, which will have the name, the label. It will not have a placeholder. It'll have a width value as well as required and hidden. And now that our backend is configured, let's create a contact form that we'll actually use. So we'll create a new form called contact form and then add a field, a single line text field called first name with no special characters and all lowercase. With the label of first name, it won't have a placeholder or default value, but it will have a width of 50%. It won't be required or a hidden field. We'll duplicate this and do the same for last name, which again will not have a placeholder default value, but it will have a width of 50%, won't be required or a hidden field. Then we'll have an email field with the name of email and the label of email. No placeholder. We'll make the width 100%, and it is required. And then we can add our phone number, which will have a name of phone, label of phone number, a placeholder of the kind of data that I want to collect, with no default value and a width of 100%. It is not required. And lastly, we'll add a checkbox that'll have the name accept terms with a label of accept terms and conditions with a question mark. It'll have a width of 100% and it will be required as well. Once that's done, we can set our submit button label, which we'll set as send. Now we can define a confirmation message, which will just say, we have received your message. We'll get back to you soon. This brings us to our emails section, which we can use to send a confirmation message to ourselves, the user submitting the form, and anyone else we'd like to send an email to. SendGrid doesn't always agree with sending an email using a dynamic field in the email to field, but I haven't had an issue using resend to do this. We'll first create an email to myself, and we will keep the subject line, you have received a message. The message itself will have a heading 1, that says you've received a message, a new message. And as a regular paragraph, we'll say this message came from email at phone number phone. Be sure to include no spaces in the dynamic values. We can also use the wildcard value to return all the data as a key value format. If you wanted to have this return as a table, you can do that by using wildcard and then table to output all of it in that table format. Now I'll create a new email that will have a dynamic value, so I can add an email that will include email here. And then we will include another H1 that just says, thank you for your message. And then we'll include first name. We'll get back to you soon. And now we can save our form and use it. The last step we'll need to do here in the CMS configuration is creating a form block. In the form directory we created in our blocks folder, create a new file called config.ts. At the top of this file, we're going to import block from payload. We'll also import our lexical editor from Payload CMS rich text lexical. We then need to export a constant called form block with the block type assigned to it. The slug will be form block with the labels of a singular form block and a plural of form blocks. Then we'll include our fields array, which will have a name of form, relation to forms with a type of relationship, and we will make this required. Underneath this, we'll need something to enable our text that will come with it. So we'll call this companion text, and then we'll label this as enable companion text, and this will have a type of checkbox. So this will allow us to create a rich text field next to our form, which will then allow us to add context to the form without having to hard code it into our website. Underneath this field, we will define our companion text with the name of companion text. The label of companion text, it'll be a rich text type with the editor being the lexical editor, and we will only show this on the condition that enable companion text returns a Boolean value of true. Lastly, we need to add this to the block configs of all the collections we want to use forms. We'll do this in our pages collection by going to our collections pages config and finding where we have our blocks, which is right here, and include our form block. We're now ready to render our form on the front end. Before we do that though, please check to make sure that you're subscribed to my channel and that you give this video a thumbs up if you're finding it helpful. Thank you for your support. Now let's get back to it. We're going to use React Hook Form to get this done, but feel free to use any method, tool, or library you prefer. Let's first run pnpm add React Hook Form and let that install. Next, we should define our fields. Let's do that by first going to our form block directory, and then we're going to use the command line to run a make directory command that will create a with, error, text, phone, message, email, number, and text area directory in our form block directory. So they all show up there. Next, I'll use the command line again to add all of the index.tsx files I need by running touch, and then with index.tsx, error / index.tsx, text, phone, message, email, number, and text area / index.tsx. And this just saves us a bunch of time of copy and pasting so we can see them show up there. To ensure these show up in my Git repo later on, I'm going to hit git add and make sure that these are added to the repository. Now let's start with the width component, which will use the width field to define how wide these fields show up in the form. So open the index.tsx file in width, and we'll start here. We will import React from React. Next, we'll export a constant called width, which will set equal to an arrow function. For the props, we need children and width, and we'll have the children be the type of React node, and then our width will be a type of string. So first, we will define a let variable called calcWidth, which will be of type string. And then we will use a switch statement on our width, where we'll have our case of full be our calc width of 100%, and then we can break that. Otherwise, we can have a default case where everything else is going to set calc width equal to calculate the width times 100% minus 0.5 rem. And then in the default case, we'll break there too. We can then return a div with the style of flex basis and the value of calc width, and then pass in the children element there. Next up, we can work on our error component. So we'll go to our index.tsx in our error. And we know that this is going to be a client component, so we can use the use client directive. And then we need to import React from React, and then import use form context from React hook form. We'll then export a constant called error set equal to an arrow function. And in the props, we'll have our name, and the name will be of type string. And then inside the function, we'll have a constant that'll destructure our form state errors, and then set that equal to use form context. And then from here, we'll return a div And in this div, we'll return the errors with the name key and the message that is in those errors as a string value. Otherwise, it will say this field is required. Now that we have a way to manage our field widths and errors, we can start building our inputs. Let's start with the text field. So we will go to our text index.tsx file, and we're going to import our type of text field from our Payload CMS plugin Form Builder types, as well as our types of field errors implementation, field values from React hook form, and use form register. And then we'll import React from React. We can export a constant called text, which will have the type of React functional component, which will then be set equal to an arrow function. And in our functional component here, we will pass in our errors with a partial, which will have our field errors implementation. And in that, we will have our x of type string, and this value will be of type any. Below our errors, we will also have our register, which will have our use form register, and we'll take any and our field values as types. And then we're also going to include our text field types and a couple of the custom fields that we created, like hidden, which will be a Boolean value, width, which will be a string value, placeholder, which we will have as optional and will be a string, and then label as a string. We can then pass in our name, errors, label, register, required, and we'll set this to be named require from props, and then hidden also as hidden from props, just to be extra clear, and then our width and placeholder. And then we can open up our constant here. We're going to be reusing a few things from our input that I created in my video about the customer auth flow, but we don't want to mess up our login forms. So we're going to create a new directory called input that will have a file called index.tsx. And we're going to go to our customer form input and copy all of this and include it in our input text here. We're going to change the constant name to be form input and now make a couple of adjustments. The first is that we want to include number and tel as types, and now we need to make a couple of imports. So we will import our types of field errors implementation from React hook form, field values, and then use form register. Then we're going to import our error component from our error directory. And then we're going to import React from React. Now in our props, we'll make a couple of adjustments. First with our errors, which will have a partial and a field errors implementation. And inside of that, we will have our x as type of string, which will have the type of any. Then our label will remain string, our name will remain string, we'll keep the type to how we just changed it. Placeholder is optional and is a string, required is Boolean and is a string, default value is optional and a string. Then we can add our hidden, which will be optional and a Boolean, and then our register, which will be our use form register type, which will take any and field values. Now we're going to set our register patterns. So the first thing we'll do is define a let variable called pattern. Then we're going to do a switch statement based on props.type. And the first case will be text. And we'll set pattern equal to required and have this be props required. And then if this is the case, we can break. We'll then use our hidden prop in a couple of different places. So the first one is here, where we'll check props hidden. And if it is, we'll return the Tailwind class hidden. But if not, it can keep its display flex column gap of 2. For our label, we're going to add an asterisk if it's required. So above our label, we'll check if props required. If it is required, we will return a span, which will have an asterisk and another span, which will be for our screen readers, which will just simply say required in parentheses. But if not, we will just return an empty string because an asterisk won't be required. Then our asterisk will have a class name of margin start 1 text red 800. And then our required will have a class name of SR only, so it only shows up for screen readers. We will keep our required props for our input. We will keep our class name as well. And our ID, we can actually remove our name and include instead our register, which will be our props.register, props.name, and then our pattern. Our placeholder can remain the same, as well as our type and our default value. But at the end of this, we can also add our hidden, which will check props hidden if this needs to be a hidden field. Below all of this, we can then add our props errors with the props name key and return our error with the name of props name if there is an error. Back to our text/index.tsx file, we can then return our width, which will have the prop width in it. We can then import our form input from our input directory in our form directory, and then bring in our form input, and then pass in our errors, our label, our name, the type, which will just be text, and then our register, which we will type in as register. Some of the props didn't show up by default, so we'll include hidden, which will be hidden from props, and placeholder, which will include our placeholder, and our required, which will be required from props. Let's do all of this again for our custom phone field. So we will pull up our phone index.tsx and remove our text field, rename this to be phone as the constant name, remove text field from here as well. And then we'll need to add a couple of types to our custom types here. The first being name, which will be of type string, and required, which will be type Boolean. The only thing we need to change here is from text to tell. And then in our input, we need to define our pattern for this. So we will add our case of tell, then set our pattern equal to required, props required, and we're also going to add a pattern here. In our pattern, we're going to have a message which will have, please format your phone number like this, and just include ways that I would like to see the phone number included. And then we're going to have a regex value here that I'm just going to copy and paste, which will validate if the input matches the formats that I'm looking for. And if that's the case, we can then break. Next up is email, where we'll again take our text field, go to our email index.tsx, change our text field to email field and our type down here also to email field, and change our constant to be email and our type to email as well. And back in our form input, we can add another case for our email case, where we'll return a pattern that will be required, props required, and then a pattern, which will have a message that just says, please enter a valid email address, and then a regex value that again, I will just copy and paste, and will only validate if it matches this valid email address pattern. And then I can break in that case as well. We'll now work on our number field. So again, taking our text field and copying it over to our number field. We'll leave text field how it is, but we will change our constant name to number and also change our type to number as well. Everything else can remain the same, including in our form input it can share the same pattern. So we can set case number to return the same pattern let variable here. Now we'll work on the text area component. So we'll go to text area and open the index.tsx file there. And this is going to be different from everything that we've done so far. So we're just going to start this from scratch. We'll import type text area field from our plugin form builder types. We'll import type field errors implementation from React hook form, as well as field values, and use form register. We'll also import React from React and our error component from the error directory. We can export a constant called text area, which will then be set equal to an arrow function. And our text area will have the type React functional component. And in the functional component, we will have our errors, which will be a partial. And that will take our field errors implementation. And in this, we can pass in X with type of string, which will take a type of any. And then we will have our register, use form register, field values, and any. And then we'll have rows, which will be optional, and this will be a number. And so this is the number of rows that will be included by default for our text area field. Now in our props, we will bring in our name, our errors, our label, our register, required, with the name actually being required from props, and then rows set equal to 3. We'll also need to include our text area field types that we imported earlier. And we can open up our function now. We'll return a div with the class name of width full. And in this div, we will have another div that has the class name of relative and margin bottom of 1 rem. In this div, we'll have a label that will return our label text, and it will have a class name of margin bottom of 4 and block, and we'll have an HTML4 attribute of name. After the label, we'll check if required from props, and if so, we'll have a span, which will have another span inside of it that just says required. And this will only show up for a class name of screen readers. So screen reader only can see that required, and we'll have an asterisk in the span with the class names of text read 800 and margin start of 1. If that's not the case, we can just return an empty string. Under our label, we can now bring in our text area input, which will have a class name of width full, BG white, text emerald 950, border emerald 950, rounded medium, padding of 2, leading tight. Then we'll have an ID of name, rows of rows. Then we can bring in our register name, and then bring in required, which will be required from props. At the very end here, we can then check errors with the name key. And if there is an error, we can return an error component with the name of name. Our message component is going to be very simple. In message/index.tsx, we're going to import our rich text component that we created in an earlier video. And then we're going to also import React from React and our serialized editor state from the rich text lexical package from Payload CMS. We'll export a constant called message and set that equal to an arrow function. In our props, we will have our message, which will then have a message of type serialized editor state. And then we will return a div with the class name of width full. And within that div, we can return, if a message exists, the rich text with the data from the message itself. There's one last input I want to set up, and that's our checkbox. You can simply use a checkbox field for this, but I want to make this a little bit more custom. So let's add a new directory in our form block directory called checkbox, and then we're going to include an icon index.tsx file. In this file, we know it's going to be a client component, so we'll use the use client directive, and then we're going to import everything as checkbox primitive from RadixUI React checkbox. And now this is not something that I have installed in my project, so I just need to run npm add RadixUI React checkbox. And now that that's done, I can import check from Lucide React, which we have been using, and then lastly React from React. We'll then have our constant checkbox be assigned the type React functional component, and this will be set equal to our props, which will then return an arrow function. In our functional component props here, we'll pass in ref, which will be optional and will be of type React ref HTML button element. And underneath that, we will have and React component props type of checkbox primitive dot root. And now in our props, we'll pass in class name, ref, and then the rest of the props. We'll then, instead of these curly braces here, pass in parentheses, and we'll use our checkbox primitive root. Inside that, we'll have our checkbox primitive indicator, and inside of this indicator, we'll pass in our check from Lucide React. The check will have a class name of height of 1 rem and width of 1 rem. The checkbox indicator will have a class name of flex items center, justify center, text current. And then our root will have a class name of peer, height of 4, width 4, shrink 0, rounded, border emerald 950, ring, offset background, focus visible, outline none, focus visible, ring 2, focus visible, ring, focus visible, ring offset 2, and then for our disabled variant, we'll have cursor not allowed, and again, disabled with the opacity of 50. Then we'll check data, state equals checked, and we can set BG to be emerald 950. And then we'll check again, data, state equals checked, and if so, we'll have text emerald 50. We'll then need to pass in our ref, which will be the ref that we assigned earlier, and then we will pass in the rest of our props. After all of that is done, we can export our constant of checkbox. Now we can create our checkbox index.tsx file, and in here we can import our type of checkbox field from not payload, but from our Payload CMS Form Builder plugin types, and then our type of field errors implementation from React Hook Form field values and use form register. We can also get our use form context from React Hook Form, the checkbox as checkbox UI from our icon, and I'm doing this so I can use our constant name of checkbox in this file as well. Then we'll need React from React, as well as our error component from the error directory, and width from the width directory. Now we can export a constant called checkbox, which will be a React functional component and will be set equal to an arrow function. Within the functional component, we are going to pass in our checkbox field types and our errors, which will be partial field errors implementation, register, use form register, field values, and then finally our custom width property as string. We'll then need our name, default value, errors, label, register, required, named as required from props, and our width. Inside our function, we will have our props set in a constant called props and set register to name with our required being set to required from props, and then a constant called set value deconstructed from our use form context hook. And then we can return our width component with the width prop being passed in. Then we'll need a div with the class name of flex items center gap of a half rem. Then we need our checkbox UI, which will have default checked set to default value, an ID of name. Then on checked change, we'll check the checked state and then do a function that will set the value to be for props name, the checked state. And then we can pass in the rest of the props. Below the checkbox UI, we will pass in a label for the HTML4 name. And in this, we will check required from props. And if so, we can pass in a span that will include another span. And in the first span, we will use an asterisk with the class name of text red 800 with margin start of 1. And then inside the internal span, we'll set class name to be for screen readers only and required in parentheses. Beneath this, we can pass in our label text. After our closing div, we will check for errors with the name key. And if there is an error, we can return the error with the name set equal to name, and then close this off with the closing width tag. The next thing we need to do in our form directory is create a new file called fields.tsx. And in this file, we're going to import all of our fields. So I will import our field checkbox from Checkbox. And I'm actually going to just copy and paste all of these values to save time, because all we're doing is importing and then exporting all of these in a fields object. And so we will have the checkbox key with the value of checkbox. Then we'll have email with email, message and message, number with number, text with text, text area, and lastly, phone. I will update this to be fields instead of field A. And now it's time to get our form designed. Let's create a new index.tsx file in our form. And we know that this is going to be a client component, so we'll use the use client directive. Then we'll import our type of form as form type and our form field block from our Payload CMS plugin Form Builder types. Then we'll import React from React, and we'll grab a couple other things from React like use callback, use state, and finally use ref. We'll then also import our form provider and use form from React hook form. We'll import the fields object we just created from our field file. We'll also import our rich text component, as well as our serialized editor state from rich text lexical from the Payload CMS package. We'll also get our get client-side URL and our submit button from our customer form submit button. And then lastly, a loader circle from Lucide React. We'll need to create a type for our form block type, which will have an optional block name, which will be of type string. The block type will be optional and we'll have the type of form block. We'll include an enable companion text Boolean value, which is optional, our form, which will be of form type that we imported, and then companion text, which is optional, which will be a serialized editor state. We can then export a constant called form block. This will be a React functional component, which will be set equal to props, and we'll open an arrow function. In the functional component here, we'll have an optional ID, which will be of type string, and we'll include our form block type as well. In our function, we will destructure our props and pull out the enable companion text, our form named as form from props. Again, our form, but we're going to destructure the ID, naming it form ID, confirmation type, confirmation message, and submit button label, and set that equal to an empty object. And then finally, our companion text as well. We can then get our form methods by setting our constant form methods set equal to the use form hook, which will take the default values of form from props dot fields. Then we're going to need to destructure our form methods, and we're going to pull out control, form state, errors, handle submit, and register. Below this, we're going to pull in a couple of use state hooks. So we'll use our first use state, which is going to be is loading and will be initially false. We'll then also use our use state for has submitted, which will take a Boolean value and is blank initially. And then lastly, we need a use state to manage our error state, which will again be blank initially, and we'll have the types for message, string, and then status, which will be optional and will also be a string. All of this can also be undefined. Now we can set our onSubmit constant and set this equal to a use callback hook, which will need some dependencies at the end of it. But first, we will pass in our data, which will be a form field block as an array, and this will be a function. In our use callback hook, we will set a let variable of loading timer ID with the type of return type of set timeout. Then we will set a constant called submit form, which is going to be an async function where we'll now set error to undefined. We'll set our loading timer ID set equal to a set timeout function, which will set is loading to true for 1,000 milliseconds or 1 full second. Then we will set our constant data to send equal to the object entries of our form data. And then we can map through that with the array of name and value and open up our arrow function here. And we will get our field with the value of name and then pass in our value as well. Then we can try our constant of request and await the fetch call from get client side URL, the API of form submissions. Then we need to pass in some options, which will be the body, which will be JSON stringify, form ID, and then our submission data to send. We'll pass in our credentials by using include, and then our headers will be content type application/JSON, and our method will be post. We can then process our response by assigning it to the constant of res await request JSON. Then we can clear the timeout with the loading timer ID and then check if our request status is greater than or equal to 400. We can set is loading to false, set our error to be a message that says the response errors at position 0 message, or just an internal server error as a string, and our status, which will be our res.post. status. Below this, we can just return to break the function. Then we can set isLoading to false, set has submitted to true. We can then catch our error E and log it in our console using a warn method, and then set isLoading to false and set error to our message, just something went wrong. And now we can void our submit form and then include our form ID as a dependency here. The last thing we need to do is return the form. So below our function here, we'll return a section that will hold our form. The section will have a class name of medium grid columns 12, gap of 1 rem, margin of 1 rem, padding of 1 rem, text emerald 950, rounded medium. Then we will check if enable companion text is true, and if that's true, that companion text exists, and the form has not been submitted. And if that's the case, we can return our rich text with the data of companion text and the class names of margin bottom 8, large, margin bottom 12, medium, column span 6, extra large, column span 4, text center, medium, text start. Now below this, we can include a div that will have a class name of padding 4, large, padding 8, border emerald 950, rounded medium, column span 6, extra large, column span 8. Inside this div will be our form provider, which will take all of our form methods. Inside the form provider, we'll check if it's not loading and has submitted, and confirmation type is equal to message, which is always the case since we removed our confirmation type selector. And if this is the case, we can return our rich text with the data of confirmation message and class name of text center. Below this, we can check is loading, and if it is loading but has not submitted, we can then return a paragraph with the class names of flex items center, margin bottom of 4, with a span, which takes a loader circle, and that loader circle will have a class name of animate spin, and margin end of 2, and the span will continue with loading, please wait. Under this, we can include our error message, which will check if an error exists, and if it does, we'll return a div with the class name of textRed 400, and in this div, we will return our error status, otherwise just the error as a string, which will then include our error message or an empty string. Below this, we can check has not submitted, and if it hasn't, we can render our form with the ID of form ID, and we'll include an onSubmit attribute that will take our handle submit with the onSubmit function inside it. Inside our form, we'll create another div that has the class name of margin bottom 4, last item margin bottom 0, small display flex, small flex wrap, and then small gap of 4. Inside this div, we will check form from props exists, and if it does, form from props should have fields, and if that's true, we can then map through our form from props fields, and with the items of field and index of index, and then pass in a function here where we'll have our const of field, which will be a React functional component of any type. Set that equal to our fields, field block type as key of type of, fields, and if the field exists, we can return our field component. The field component needs a couple props, including a key, which will be of index. Below that key, we will pass in our form, which will be our form from props. We can then also pass in all of our field props and our form methods. We can also pass in our control, our errors, and finally our register. Finally, we just need to make sure that this conditional chain takes place and our type errors go away. Below this, we can return null if there is no field. Next, we need our submit button, which is going to be placed below our div and above our closing form tag. And we can just pull in our submit button here and put in our is loading state, as well as our submit button label with a non-null operator there, because it can't be a null value. And then we'll also want to include our form with our form ID here. That way, whenever we click this submit button, we're submitting this form and no other forms. The problem though is that this submit button doesn't take the form prop, so we're going to add it by just adding the form prop here, then adding the type as optional string, and then typing in form and passing in our form prop. And now our error will go away. The last thing we need to do to get our form working is to add it to our blocks renderer. So we can do that by going to our blocks index.tsx file, and we're going to need to import our form block from our blocks form directory. We're also going to need to bring in our page type, and then we can add our form block to our block components, and then pass in our page, which is where our form block is configured, and add our pages block field called content, and this is ready to go. So now we can see what this looks like by spinning up our development server and then going to our home page in our collections. So we'll go to pages, then to our home page, and below our content with media block, we'll add content, and it'll be a form block. That will be our contact form, and we will enable our companion text, which is simply going to have an H2 that says contact us, and then we'll just have text that says use this form to contact us, and we'll get back to you ASAP. And then we can save this. Before I load up the front end, I'm going to add to my globals.css file some more styles in our Tailwind CSS configuration that'll make these changes a little bit more apparent. So in globals.css, I'm going to change my H1 to be 3XL and our font weight to be bolder. And then I'm going to add the H2 with font size of 2XL and font weight of bold. And now when I save this and we go to our home page and hit refresh, we see this contact form show up here. And it is fully responsive based on the classes we set up as we went. So now we have this nicely styled form, and we can see our validation at work by typing in my email address and then a misconfigured phone number, and we won't accept the terms and condition. I can hit send, and I get this please format your phone number like this. We don't see that it's red though, so if we go to our error index.tsx, we can then set our class name to be textRed of 400. And when I save this, we can see that our error text shows up correctly. I can then accept terms and conditions, but I still can't send because I need to add an actual phone number in that format. The validation then goes away. And then if I get rid of these things that make the email valid, I get an error that says, please enter a valid email address. And when I fix that, I can then hit send. And we have received your message, we'll get back to you soon. And we can see that this gets to our form submissions here. This video doesn't end here though. There are still two things I want to do with this form. The first one is to enable reCAPTCHA. We'll use Google's reCAPTCHA, which is a free service to protect forms from spam and abuse. If you have a different provider, you can use that too, but I'll go with this option for its ease of use. You'll need to sign up to Google's developer tools at developers.google.com/reCAPTCHA to get started. Register your site with a label and use version 2 with the I'm not a robot checkbox. Then you can add your domain, which I've just added the local host for now. It's important to note that you don't need to and you can't include your protocol, port, or path name, just the host name. Once this is set up, you'll grab the site key they provide and add that as an environment variable called next public reCAPTCHA site key, which you'll see in a second. And you'll also need the secret key that's provided, which you can add as an environment variable called next private reCAPTCHA secret key. We'll then install Google's reCAPTCHA React library by running npm add React Google reCAPTCHA. And then we also want the types, so we'll run npm add types React Google reCAPTCHA. Earlier in this video, we created a field called require reCAPTCHA, which we now need to bring into our form/index.tsx. So we'll go over to our blocks, form index.tsx, and then we'll go all the way up to our form block type, where we'll add to our form type here the ampersand, and then require reCAPTCHA with a question mark to make it optional, Boolean. Inside our form block constant, we'll need to include the require reCAPTCHA option here in our destructured constant. Then above our onSubmit constant, we will store our reCAPTCHA in a useRef with the type of reCAPTCHA, and the default value will be null. Below our submit form constant, we will create a new constant called CAPTCHA value, which will check the current value of the CAPTCHA. If that exists, we will get the current value of the CAPTCHA. Otherwise, we'll return undefined. And then we can check if reCAPTCHA and there is no CAPTCHA value. Then we'll check if the field requires reCAPTCHA. And if it does, we can set is loading to false, set our error to say message, please complete reCAPTCHA. And then we can just return to break the function. Now, in order for us to be able to validate this on the back end, in our try statement, we're going to include this in the body of our request. So I will include reCAPTCHA and then the CAPTCHA value, and this will be sent to our backend. At the end of our request, we will want to reset our CAPTCHA by using the reset function here. And we want to do this also if it doesn't return anything. So if the validation fails, we'll want to reset it as well. So we can do, again, reCAPTCHA current reset, and then we need to add our require reCAPTCHA as a dependency here. We can then add the reCAPTCHA component down at the bottom above our submit button. We can check if require reCAPTCHA is true. If it is, we can then pass in a div. And this div will have a class name of padding left and right of 4, padding top of half a rem, padding bottom of a rem, display flex, justify, center. And then we can pass in our reCAPTCHA component, which takes a site key and a ref, and then also a class name. So our site key will be process.env next public reCAPTCHA site key, which is one of the two environment variables I told you to collect, or an empty string. Our ref will be a reCAPTCHA, and then our class name will be overflow hidden, a width of 300 pixels, a height of 76 pixels, rounded small, border emerald 950. Now to tie this all together, we need to go back to our payload config, and then we're going to go to our form submission overrides. In the form submission overrides option here, we're going to include our fields, which will take the default fields, and we'll return all those default fields, but we're going to add a couple of our own. So we'll bring in one called reCAPTCHA, which will be a type of text. And to validate this, we will do an async function, which will take value with a type of any, and the request object and sibling data also with the types of any. We'll open up our function and get a constant called form, which will await our rec payload find by ID. Pass in our ID of sibling data, form, and then collection of forms. If the form doesn't require reCAPTCHA, we can then return true because it doesn't matter. But if there's no value, we need to tell the user to please complete the reCAPTCHA. And lastly, we can return a constant called response and await our fetch, which will check the Google API for reCAPTCHA. So I am just going to copy and paste that value and include the environment variable for our next private reCAPTCHA secret key, and the response needs to be value. So to break down this URL, it's https:/google.com/reCAPTCHA/API/site-verify ? Secret equals our secret key, and response equals the value. At the end of this fetch, we need to add one option, which will be our method as post. Below our method, we need to include a constant called data, which we're going to await our res.json. Then if our data is not a success, we can return invalid CAPTCHA, else we can return true. So to test all of this out, I'll spin up our development server and go to our forms. And in our form, we currently do not have CAPTCHA required. So if I refresh this, we'll see the form load up and I should still be able to submit it without any issue. Now I can refresh the form and require reCAPTCHA here on the form on the back end. And again, refresh, and now I should see reCAPTCHA show up. So if I try to submit this form without filling out the reCAPTCHA, I get hung up here because in our form index, we don't dismiss our loading timer ID. So to fix that, we're just going to move all of our reCAPTCHA stuff above our loading timer ID. So now what we'll get when I refresh with a fresh form, it'll just say, please complete reCAPTCHA, as if it was just a required field. Now I can do the reCAPTCHA and hit send. And finally, we'll have our next form submission here. And we can see the reCAPTCHA value there as well. The last example to go over in this video is using forms with HubSpot. You can do this with any CRM like Salesforce or marketing automation tool like MailChimp. If you don't have a free HubSpot account, go ahead and pause this video and do that now to follow along. You don't need to set up the API to do this. You simply need to create a form. You'll want to use the same fields you used for your Payload CMS form named exactly the same. After you create your form, you'll see the ability to embed that form. There you'll find your portal ID, which you'll want to save as an environment variable called hsportalID. You'll also see a form ID, which you'll want to add to the form you created in Payload in the HubSpot form ID field we created at the beginning of this video. So first, I'm going to go to the form that we created and add my HubSpot ID for that form. We're going to need to do two things in order for this to work. The first is to handle the form submission in our Form Builder plugin configuration using an after-change hook and pass in the HubSpot cookie from the front end. So we'll go back to our payload config, and in our form submissions override, we are going to include a hook, which will be an after change hook, and we'll pass in an async function that will have our document and our request object. And we will check our request and get the payload logger to pass in some information that the form submission was received. Then we'll need a constant called body that will check if the request has JSON. We can then await our request for the JSON. Otherwise, we can just get an empty object. Then we will need a function called send submission to HubSpot, and that will be set equal to an async function that will have the type of promise void assigned to it, and then we can open up the function. We'll need a constant that is destructured for our form and submission data from our doc. And then we'll need our portal ID, which is one of the variables I told you to store in your environment variables. So that's HS portal ID. Then we need our data, and that'll be set equal to an object that has our context, which will check for the HubSpot cookie in the body that we're sending from the form. And if that's the case, we can pass in HUTK as the key and assign the value body HubSpot cookie to it. We'll also want to pass in the page name, which we'll define later, but we'll check if page name is in the body. And if it is, we can return the body page name, otherwise an empty string, and do the same for the page URI by checking page URI in the body. If it is, return the page URI. If not, return an empty string. Continuing in our data, we're going to include our fields, which will get our submission data and map through those with the key being a type of any. And we can open this up, get the name with the key field, and then return value with key value. Then finally, we can try to await. First, we will fix this by adding a comma up there. Now we will try awaiting our fetch, which we're going to fetch the HubSpot Forms API. So I'm going to copy and paste that here, which is going to be the api.hsforms.com, submissions version 3, integration submit, passing in our portal ID, and then our form HubSpot ID. And in this, we're going to need to pass in a few options. The first one being the body, which is going to be a JSON stringify data. Then we'll need our headers, which we will pass in our content type, application, JSON. Then we need our method to be post. Then we can catch our error E, which will be of an unknown type, and then log this in our payload logger as an error and just say first the error and then a message that says form submission not sent to HubSpot. We'll then await our send submission to HubSpot function. Before we finish the front end of our form, we'll also want to configure HubSpot in two ways. First, we'll want to make sure that the HubSpot form listener isn't picking up on our forms if they fail validation. HubSpot adds a listener to every form, even non-HubSpot forms. So this can cause duplicate form submissions to come through, one with the data you set up and another with fields that HubSpot guesses is correct. You can find the setting to turn off data collection from non-HubSpot forms by going to your HubSpot settings, scrolling down to Tools, and opening the Marketing menu. After clicking on Forms, you can select the non-HubSpot Forms tab and turn data collection from website forms to the off position. I'll link to that setting in the description. The second thing we need to do before finishing the front end is to add our HubSpot tracking code. I've chosen to do this in my layout.tsx file. So I can go to my front end, layout.tsx. This is done simply by adding a script tag from nextjs, which will have an ID set equal to HS script loader. It'll be async. We will defer the load. Then we will have our type set equal to text JavaScript. And then lastly, we'll need our source, which will be our JavaScript HubSpot scripts.com / our portal ID.js. Now that all this is set up, we need a way to get the cookie, which we can do using a utility function. In your utilities directory, we're going to create a new file that we're going to call getCookie.ts. In this file, we're going to export a function called getCookie that will get the cookie name which will be a type of string, with the whole function returning a string. The first thing we need to do is assign cookie string to a constant and use regular expressions to get the cookie name and concatenate that with a regex value that will return the name followed by anything except a semicolon. So that's what this regex means here, and then we will execute on the document cookie. Then we can return everything after the equal sign, or if the cookie's not found, it'll return an empty string. So we will return our decode URI component with cookie string as a check. If that's true, we will return the cookie string to string and replace with another regex value, which I am going to just copy and paste. It'll replace all those values with an empty string. And if that doesn't return anything, we'll return an empty string. Now let's finish our form. In our form index.tsx, so form index.tsx, we will import get cookie from our utility that we just created. And then we'll also need to import use path name from next navigation. Above our onSubmit function, we're going to create a constant called path name and set that equal to use path name. Then in our try statement, above our constant request, we're going to create another constant called HubSpot cookie. Set that equal to get cookie, which will look for HubSpot UTK, which is the HubSpot tracking code. Then we need another constant called page URI, which remember we just set up in our form submissions override. And this will be our get client side URL, not the API. And it will include the path name there. Then we'll want our slug parts, which will break apart our page URI at the /. And then we'll get our const of page name, which will take our slug parts at the last index. And if it's equal to an empty string, it'll just return home. Otherwise, it'll return slug parts at the last index. Now in our body, below our form, submission data, and reCAPTCHA, we can add our HubSpot cookie, our page URI, and our page name. Now we can test our form to make sure that we see the information get sent over to HubSpot by filling out the required fields in the form. So for good measure, I will refresh it, and I can add my name, my email address, and then a phone number configured however I want it to be. Then I'll accept the terms and conditions and prove I'm not a robot by selecting fire hydrants, apparently. Lots of them. And then I can hit send and let this load. And now if I go to my HubSpot form, I can go to my submissions and see I have a new submission from today on the home page. So I can now see that this is working properly. There's so much you're able to do with forms, and this is just the beginning. You can use this plugin to accept payments, allow people to subscribe to your newsletter, or as I've shown here, allow people to contact you and sync that data to a CRM. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content around Payload CMS, Next.js, and more. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.